Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, I have with me Christian Koblmiller. He is the Chief Data Officer at the International Committee of the Red Cross. We're going to be talking about developing a framework for maximizing data in the humanitarian sector, an important part of humanity and society. So super excited to have Christian on the show. Christian, welcome along. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Jason, for having me.
No worries, and great to have you here. Let's get started with hearing a bit about the organization you work for, a bit about your role, and then we'll get into the meat of this framework and of how you deliver value out of data.
Sure. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the formal name, or ICRC as we refer to it as, is an organization that's about 150 years old, I think 152 or something. It is one component of, let's say, the International Red Cross Network, which also consists of national societies in 100 or almost 200 countries.
Right.
And it's the biggest player in this network, and it focuses exclusively on supporting victims of armed conflict. Which sets us apart a little bit from other players in the network who might also assist with humanitarian aid for, let's say, natural catastrophes and things like that. The type of stuff the ICRC engages in, the types of activities are all geared towards, let's say, victims of armed conflict. So this includes things like providing nursing and care to them, protecting them when they're imprisoned, things like that, and to make sure that they get treated according to international humanitarian law, making sure that different warring parties are aware of international humanitarian law is also a very big part of the ICRC. So a lot of education, a lot of just ensuring that sometimes quite obscure parties are aware of these things.
Right.
Protection, care for the civil population, things like that, economic support, quite an array of activities.
And that's and is it one global organization, or are you kind of made up of lots of sort of smaller parts?
Yeah, so our entity is actually a global organization powered by about 20,000 employees worldwide in about let's say 120 or so operational centers, let's call them, around the world, about 80 countries. And of course, the contexts in each country is very different. There's quite a variety of topics and issues.
Yeah, I'm sure, and local, as you say, local laws, local challenges, all quite unique, I guess, in different countries, and operational challenges, and I can sense the data challenges, which we'll come to, but great. And of course, I know the Red Cross. Is that the same as the International Committee of Red Cross, or are they?
So it's all under the Red Cross umbrella, right? And Red Cross, Red Crescent actually is what it is. But then you have all these national societies which really operate at a national level, and who all have their own focus areas, have their own structures, and then they kind of cooperate under the Red Cross, Red Crescent umbrella.
Right, great.
But it's all pretty much the same motivation.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. I guess then it's also really interesting to hear then how you and your role sort of sit within the organization, what you're responsible for, and a bit about sort of how you sort of ended up in sort of the chief data officer sort of position. I think it'd be a bit about that background would be great to hear.
So I actually got started quite early in working with data. I spent quite a bit of time in my youth developing computer games and computer game development platforms. Then sort of worked for a while in consumer goods, switched to financial services. Spent about 20 years of my career there.
Right.
And at some point, this opportunity came up, and I thought, it might be fun actually to explore a totally different space with totally different issues and challenges from a data perspective. If you look at the use cases, right, in financial services, they're always kind of the same. So here we're dealing with entirely different use cases. Sometimes the approaches are still quite the same,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, you're dealing with data and all that. But that's really, for me, besides the nature of the work that the ICRC does, I think it was also quite attractive to explore a totally different industry.
Brilliant. And your role there is the chief data officer. Where does it sit within the organization?
Yep.
And and how long has it sort of been in its current form?
Yeah, so the role's was established actually about 2 years ago when I joined. So my first generation CDO at this organization,
Right.
which I think is not uncommon across industries. In general, I think the profile is not hasn't been around for that long. It actually, in our case, it currently resides in an organization called Digital Transformation and Data.
Right.
So this organization reports all the way up to the top, and as the name suggests, focuses on transformation. What does the organization need to do to become more digital in terms of services it provides, in terms of interaction channels it engages in. And of course, with that comes the question of, okay, what does that mean for data, and what do we need to have in place to make all this happen? So that's where it's positioned. I think from a data perspective, of course, we're not just focusing on, even though that's already quite a big piece, but we're not just focusing on making digital things work and enabling that kind of thing, but also we're paying a lot of we're spending a lot of time actually looking at things like efficiency. How do we what do we need to put in place to make to let data flow more efficiently, to cut out a lot of the, let's say, manual work that still traditionally exists across the board. People doing data quality checks, very manual data analysis, where they spend a lot of time preparing data, connecting data, and all that. So big question for us is, what do we need to do to make that more efficient and to cut out a lot of the nonsense, lower the cost, and all those things. And the other key part that we're also working on is to look at who are our information consumers, right? Mostly humans, of course, internal ones, external ones. In the humanitarian sector, if you look at it, there's a lot of need for large players like the UN, for example, Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, to collaborate on things. So those are also very big, very, very important stakeholders for us.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have the management layer at HQ. We have management layers out in the field. We have operational staff in the field. So what are their information to understand all the different information needs, and to do our best to help support these functions with data is also a big part of what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually in such a large global and I guess in some ways disparate organization, certainly geographically, and in a scenario where you're in conflict zone, the kind of what I've sort of seen in similar circumstances is the use of technology, the use of data capture is actually one of the bigger challenges than what you then do with that data off the back of it. But the need and aspiration is very high. Have you found that there's a kind of a part of the role which is ensuring that we collect the data in the first place and make that as easy as possible? Or is it much more about, well, we've got access to the data and now we need to surface it and make it quality and get good insights from it?
I'd say it's all of those things, right? Even data capture is a big part of the overall system, right?
Mm.
And there, what I find quite interesting, particularly coming from the commercial world, is that if you first look at it and you don't understand the details, you might say, okay, there's a lot of manual data capture. We need to automate that, right? We'll equip people with mobile devices, and then we can improve that. The reality, though, is that in a lot of, or there's a lot of aspects where you can't introduce mobile devices. Prisons, for example, right? You're not allowed to take mobile devices into prisons, right? Yet,
Right.
we want our staff to record what they see, what they find, what the stories people tell them, and so on. And that ultimately has to happen on paper, but then still leaves the question of, okay, how do we capture that information from that point on in a maximally efficient way? There's data protection also that comes into play, right? We can't just send handwritten forms to some central service facility to have this stuff digitized. So there's those types of aspects. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our best to to make these processes as efficient as we can, but there are these types of limits to be aware of. Of course, there's lots of other examples where we can use mobile devices and where we are already employing tools to make that easier. Of course, then the challenge goes on, and the question becomes, okay, now you're collecting all this data. How are you collecting it? Does it fit together, right? Does this data pertain to the same reference points and so on, that you can later on connect it automatically and so on? So but yes, that those are some key questions also, because there's so many different operational activities. So to get this consistency across the board is quite a challenge.
What are some of the other challenges? I'm thinking more organizationally, I guess, around data at kind of this scale and this type of organization that you've seen sort of in your first couple of years there.
I'd say for me, one of our key challenges is that I think historically there hasn't been a data perspective really, right? There've certainly been the IT perspectives, right? The systems, lots of systems supporting different types of processes. But I think to look at that, this idea of looking at it through a data lens, right? What does this mean? And then, of course, you're no longer looking at it system by system, but maybe topic by topic. And since this, I think historically, this responsibility wasn't there. Nobody really had this focus. That means that these activities are also not very organized, right? So really they're spread quite in a few different places. And now when we're trying to establish, let's say, standards, standard ways of doing things, even standard data assets, standardizing data assets, all those things are sometimes quite challenging, because there's lots of different units that until now have been acting quite independently. So now we're trying to change that, and that sometimes creates isn't as easy as you would want it to be.
Yeah, well, for good practical reasons, but also just the managing that a large group of stakeholders and marshalling them to a place that is positive for both them, because that's important, and the wider organization, which is also sort of it shouldn't be, but sometimes a conflicting challenge is making sure these things are fit for purpose and beneficial to both the people and the organization.
Yes, which is quite difficult sometimes, because sometimes you propose something, and the value that you're after doesn't occur where the change is happening, right? So then how do you convince somebody to take part in that when the value is elsewhere? It's like a lot of things in life and society. That's a challenge.
It's a greater good obligation, I suppose, on individuals. But yeah, that's the job. That's part of your job, I guess, to make sure that people get it right, get where you're going, get what the benefit is to the broader organization, and how ultimately that helps everybody and your cause, which I suppose is the end point.
Yes, I think a big part of our work, and we're not nearly doing enough at the moment, but it's really I guess advertising for different types of frameworks, for different ways of doing things, to really, communication and selling ideas. I think is really big part of our work.
Yeah, for sure. Have you turned to a way of solving this thing? So obviously you've been there for a couple of years. You've, I guess, got your grips with the organization as a whole. We mentioned at the start of this, sort of talking about a framework for how you go about delivering value. Have you come up with a way of kind of how you're going to tackle this, or are already tackling it?
Yeah, I think there's the way I look at it is really there's quite a number of layers that we have to tackle, and part of the challenges, I think, or one of our biggest challenges really is to get these different layers understood, and the interdependencies between these layers understood. To give an example, right? So there's certainly a sort of technical layer, or more technical layer, where we look at, how do we move data around, where do we collect it, how do we make it available, how do we process it, like where do we apply, for example, or how do we apply analytics or data science type pipelines. So we have this type of framework, but then we're setting up to support the entire organization, so that's covers the central types of activities, but also field activities. So we have that, but in order to make that work, for example, you then rely on services, like human services, to be available, right? So if somebody, for example, to give an example, right, if somebody, part of our framework is for example, a data and content acquisition capability, which just makes, pulls in data from whatever data source you might be interested in, internal ones, external ones, and so on. So if you imagine somebody in the field, well, they could use this capability to acquire some local data. I don't know, the weather report, satellite images, whatever. But do you really want them to set this up themselves, or shouldn't there be, from an efficiency perspective, shouldn't there be a central service that they can just call up and say, I want this to be set up? So then you may have, so this is a kind of interdependency that's important, because in order for all these processes to be as efficient as they can be, you need both. You need the technical, or more or less technical, capabilities, and you want services and service capacities to be in place to deliver these types of activities, like attaching a new data source and so on, in a very efficient fashion.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and there's other aspects, but sometimes, or for us, I would say, explaining why one comes with the other, and you have to look at all these strategies as a package. That is quite difficult to explain why it needs to be that way, because you might just say, well, data capabilities, they're just, we're just going to buy technology and then we're done. But it's not that simple.
Yes, if only it was. I mean, you talk, most of the sort of stuff you're talking about there is almost the management of data. So how do we identify, we're not going to know all the data sources we're ever going to need. So how do we create a management set of processes, data management set of processes that allow us to quickly identify, ingest, get, and make available certain data sets in a certain way? Is that fair to say?
Yes, exactly. Because today, if we look at, and this is probably true for many organizations, but I think at an organization like this one, external data really, and very local data, plays a much larger role than, let's say, I know it from financial services, right?
Right.
But so then the question is, okay, if this is true, and everybody needs data and has a need to source their own or data or content for their own specific purpose, how do we really want everybody to do that individually, right? When a lot of the data ultimately is shared. Think of COVID data, where we, I think we have many teams sourcing exactly the same data. Um, part of the idea is really to have one place where you set up these data flows, and then obviously one place where this data ends up, and then another and one place where people can find it. So all those things, that's part of a framework we've designed, and that we're in the early stages of now building, to make sure that anybody in the organization, whether that's at the field level, at HQ level, understands what's available, to really make a good choice, as to, does it really make sense to introduce yet another version of this? And this goes for data sources as well as, at the higher level, things like business intelligence, metrics, ratios, and whatnot, KPIs, reports, right? So we want one place where people can really look these things up and decide whether, they can use what exists, or whether they need to build something on their own. And yeah, so that for us is a key component of getting to a place where we just manage data more efficiently.
And do you, again, so that's kind of like provision of data, good quality, secure data, consistent, and a bit about efficiency and making sure we get the right stuff to the right people. Do you look at this the other way round in terms of business challenge, business opportunity, organizational issues back to data? So, I imagine there's some fundraising activity that you have, and you've got a whole bunch of philanthropists and sponsors and supporters that there's some really juicy information in there about some of the challenges. So do you kind of look at it from a sort of data and provision of data, and your responsibility is ensuring the kind of the smooth movement and availability of that data, or is it much more about kind of the additional value add, I suppose, on top of that, around insights and supporting the decision making of the organization?
Yes, I would say we look at all, or we try to look at all those angles, right? So I think on one hand, what I've just described before is sort of the basic householding stuff of managing data, right? You want very often compare this to cleaning a garage, right? You want if you have a messy garage, right, it's going to take you very long to find your stuff, your tools, and so on. Whereas if you have your garage is in order, it's just where to find that tool, and you'll be super efficient doing that, and you'll have it real fast. So I think that to me is like organizing your data, and actually organization is almost a different level already, but I think that having the technical capabilities is one layer. You need to have those. Otherwise, the next layers are not going to work. The next one is organization. How do you organize data? So this is where master data comes in, right? This is also where you've mentioned fundraising. This is where what I call knowledge graphs kind of come in. So this is where you then look at, okay, now if I have all this data, right, how can I organize it in a way to let's say to get to understand it, to really understand it, right? So for example, in fundraising, and I spent a lot of time in wealth management, which is quite similar, right? You understand, you try to understand your the sources of funds really well, right? What's their motivation? What is an appropriate proposal for them, right? So that means you need to organize your data in a way that so you can answer these questions, right? You can respond and match, let's say, candidates for funding with potential funders. So I think that's then that's where that really pertains to the way you organize data, and there we're also trying to do that, but that of course is also not the easiest thing, because that means a lot of change, right? You may be organizing data today in one way, or historically in one way. In our case, that means that we have we treat funders or differently to suppliers, let's say, and partners, right? When really they're all organizations and we could treat them the same way. Same with people and so on. So, but of course, to get from where we are today, or where the organization has been traditionally, to this new way of managing this information will take us time, it costs money. So we have to make these proposals, get those funded. So I think it's going to be a multi-year journey until we're at a place where we can really enable a lot of these use cases with data. But we do look at it from both sides.
Brilliant. No, that's great, and it's interesting because the way that there's different ways to monetize data. You can monetize it by making it cheaper to look after. You can monetize it by identifying ways of reducing your costs for managing the organization and running the service. You can monetize it by even charging people to have access to it. Externals, particularly in an organization like yours, where you're the center of a certain niche of humanitarian aid. So you're sitting on a potentially a pot of data that other all sorts of people, whether you charge or not is another question, but governments and other humanitarian organizations and hospitals and all sorts of people, I can imagine, would be interested in the collection of data that you have, and they would have their own use cases that could be quite useful to serve. Is that kind of external provision of data? I think you mentioned earlier, sort of UN, for example.
Yep.
Is that external provision of data or insight, one or both, something that's sort of on the agenda?
It absolutely is, and I think there is even, historically, I'm sure for the last 100 years or so, this kind of exchange of information has been going on between these organizations, although some of them aren't that old. But I think the potential is definitely there. I think today I would argue it's a little bit, it's a lot of it is manual and ad hoc, right? So I think I would bet there's a lot of exchange of spreadsheets and things like that. So I think today, across the industry, I think there's not a lot of really systematic exchange of information going on.
Right.
From a data perspective, so if you're a data person like me, you think that, well, this is crazy. There's so much potential there, right? Just get your act together, exchange data, and then you can all become more efficient because you won't be tackling the same issues in the same places and so on. I think the reality, though, is this is another thing that comes in. I think it's a lot of times these organizations have their very clearly defined scope, and that they can't veer from, because sometimes funding is tied to those scopes. So I think in reality there's that kind of inflexibility today. Maybe that'll be different in 30 years. Then there's the general hesitation, I think, to share data. A lot of the data obviously is sensitive, and if you think about the risks of exposing data information about these individuals is really high. I mean, they're very, very, they're definitely, there's a threat to their physical lives. It's not like in banking where the threat is, the risk is to lose money. Here it's really people's lives at stake. So I think that's also a very big consideration in all this. And then, of course, another question is also, do these organizations really have, is their data in a shape that they can exchange it on a systematic basis? Also rather questionable, I think. But in general, yes, I think the potential is there. It's something we pay attention to. It's something that we design our frameworks to be ready for. But I think there's a lot of other questions that are not of a technical nature that need to be answered to make this happen.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Cool. I wouldn't mind just sort of moving to, and we've sort of touched on it a bit, but just the kind of key use cases where data can really play a part. So we've mentioned sort of fundraising, and I've never really clocked that analogy with wealth management, by the way. So your hire makes a lot of sense to me now. But I can imagine there's a whole supply chain. You're getting products and support to people, the sort of resource management, your 20,000 employees, making sure they're in the right place. You don't know where all the conflicts necessarily going to pop up, and there's some that last a long time, some that are quite short-lived, I'm sure. Sorry if that's a novice summary, but that I can imagine there's some
accurate, yeah.
there's some pockets of opportunity, I imagine, in all those things to make it more efficient, to make it quicker, to make it better. Where's the top few things that will really kind of move the needle, I guess, for the organization?
I think, I think you're exactly right. I think that there's a lot of different pockets of opportunity. And I think in some of these pockets, like if you look at logistics, for example, which you've mentioned also, or finance, I think a lot of these already in quite good shape, where a lot of these opportunities have been exploited and have delivered. I mean, and things have been built that actually deliver these a lot of value. Not that there's no opportunities left there, but I think some areas in better shape than others. I think things like fundraising, that's definitely an area where there's a lot of opportunity there. That it's definitely one of our focus areas. I think there's also other areas that might not be obvious if you're not familiar with the Red Cross. Is, for example, this idea of helping people find the missing, right? I mean, in areas of conflict, a lot of times people go missing, and since I think pretty much the inception of the Red Cross, this has been a very core service for to basically help in the search for missing. So if you look at that from a data perspective, is also quite an interesting challenge. How do we enable that, right? And that it has quite also technically quite a few interesting, challenging bits, because on one hand, you cannot really just bring data together from all different corners of your organization. There are boundaries, and then it doesn't mean you can't do matching, but you can't really bring all your data to the same place. So that's quite challenging from that perspective. Also, you want to extend your search to other humanitarian actors or other organizations, and of course, certainly nobody will want to share data about individuals with anyone else. So I think that's quite an interesting data challenge. How do you make that work? How do you support that as best as possible? There's lots of opportunity there to basically make that happen better. It's a very, very important part of the ICRC. So that's definitely one area. I think there's other, then as part of that, there's also, like if you think of data science use cases, right? There are I think at this stage it's fair to say it's experiments, more or less, like to explore, what is facial recognition, for example. How can that play a role, and how can that help in this challenge? So you get things like that. Another area I think that I think is quite interesting also is to understand, and it's obviously also a very important piece, is to understand context, right? What's going on in a given context. This is, in order for the ICRC to be, and any of these actors to be able to do anything in these places, they need to understand who they're dealing with, who they're working with, right? And obviously they work with all parties, non-state armed groups, things like that. And you have to really understand who they are, who the people are who play a role there, and what they're up to, what's happening, right? Events that are happening, things like that. So I think that's really an area of a gigantic opportunity if you can use technology and sort of data methods to create this kind of transparency, which today is largely of course reliant on human intelligence, and I think to a degree always will be, but there's certainly a lot of ways I think we can support that with technology and data approaches.
Yeah.
So that's a big area. And then there's I think there's definitely more.
Yeah,
but those are, I think, are our biggest ones.
Yeah, there's some really interesting opportunities there, and I can it's interesting where we often talk to many people who it's a sort of situation where they're sort of, in the phrase, sort of data rich, insight poor. In some ways, you've got a challenge around access to, and either legally or otherwise, to data that would really add value. There's so many sort of data sets I'm sure in the local police files and local government organizations, but that you just don't have access to, but the collaboration would be really powerful. And as you say, some of the things we've mentioned at the beginning around just we are unable to digitize some things, and we're going to have to make that as smooth as possible. But and maybe there's some text scanning software that you can use that turns text into data, turns it into useful data for insight. But I can see that there's a kind of challenge end to end of the data value chain, from collection through to insight. And I think what a great opportunity, and it's been brilliant talking to you and hearing about that challenge. And I'm really hoping you get some good funding to push your frameworks forward, because they sound great. But I just wanted to sort of wrap up with saying thank you for investing your time talking to me and helping to understand another sort of angle on being a chief data officer, and another angle of organizations trying to wrap their arms around this challenge. Yours is very unique, I must admit, to so many, certainly in the commercial sector. But I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for having me.
No problem. No problem. And thanks everyone for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you again soon.